We are live streaming our bi-weekly class with Shai Held of the Hadar Institute. And we're looking at Psalms and up. We've got new people arriving by the second. And this week we're going to be looking at Psalm 30. So that will be a great time. Shai, I think I'll pass it over to you. I'm just busily pressing the admit button for new arrivals. So I think I'll pass over to you and get our screen share going of the psalm whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you, Lex. Hi, everyone. I hope, as always, this finds you as safe and as well as possible. Today's project is going to be a close reading of Psalm 30 that is familiar to many people from the daily liturgy, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. You should either be able to download the source sheet or have a Tanakh open if you can do that. And I want to say very little by way of introduction, because I would like to give people a chance to hear the text. But what I do want to do is ask 3 questions that either we'll get to talk about a little bit at the end, or at very least, I hope that you'll be thinking about and kind of wrestle to your own responses to. One of them is, as I ask often about Tehillim, about Psalms, can people who might not share every theological assumption of the psalmist pray these words? What are the challenges and what are the possibilities there? Assuming you don't share every theological assumption that underlies the text. Second of all, what happens to a prayer like this that appears to grow out of a particular moment in a psalmist's life when you make that part of Judaism's keva, when you make that part of Judaism's fixed commitment to prayer? In other words, what happens to a text that is really an expression of spontaneous joy on some level when you make it a liturgical commitment? How does your experience of saying it, praying it, hearing it change as a result? Maybe as a footnote that you can ask, how can one keep the saying of a psalm like that vibrant and alive? And then third, given that such a text is part of liturgy, can a person who has not been healed stand fully inside of the I in this text? And if so, how? What is, and if so, how? Sorry, how? What does it look like for someone who has been pleading for healing and hasn't received it to express this prayer of joyous thanksgiving for having been healed? Those are pretty big questions, obviously. And, I'm happy to hear people's thoughts about them, especially over email later. But those are just kind of the ones I want to invite you to keep in the back of your mind as we go here. And I need, if possible, as always, a volunteer to read in the Hebrew. I will recite the JPS translation as we go, and then kind of nitpick with the translation later on. Let's see here if I can, since I don't have any hands up, or actually I'm getting blocked here. Hold on one sec, I'm sorry. Gallery view, I've lost the gallery view. Oh, I can't have a gallery view because the sources are up, I think. Okay, Danny Grossberg, can I rope you into doing this?
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you great, thank you.
Okay, very good.
So you read a verse, I'll translate the JPS translation, and then we'll go, okay?
Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid.
A psalm of David, a song for the dedication of the house.
Aromimcha Adonai ki dilitani velo simachta oivai li.
I extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up and not let my enemies rejoice over me.
Adonai Elohai shivati elecha vatirpaeni.
O Lord, my God, I cried out to you and you healed me.
Adonai he'elita min she'ol nafshi chitani miyordi vor.
O Lord, you brought me up from Sheol, preserved me from going down into the pit.
Zamru l'Adonai chasidav v'hodu l'zecher kodsho.
O you faithful of the Lord, sing to him and praise his holy name.
Ki rega ba'apo chayim birtsono, ba'erev yalin bechi v'laboker rina.
For he is angry but a moment, and when he is pleased, there is life. One may lie down weeping at nightfall, but at dawn there are shouts of joy.
Va'ani amarti b'shalvi bal emot la'olam.
When I was untroubled, I thought, I shall never be shaken.
Adonai birtzoncha he'amadata laharari oz. Histarta fanecha hayiti nivhal.
For you, O Lord, when you were pleased, made me firm as a mighty mountain. When you hid your face, I was terrified.
I don't have the rest of I just have Elecha Adonai Ekra, and
You got it there on the screen.
here? Beriditi El Shachat? No.
No, verse 9, Elecha.
I got it. Good. Elecha Adonai Ekra, Be'el Adonai Et Chanan.
I call to you, O Lord, to my Lord I made appeal.
Ma betza bedami beriditi El Shachat. Hayodcha afar hayagid amitecha.
What is gained from my death, from my descent into the pit? Can dust praise you? Can it declare your faithfulness?
Shema Adonai v'choneni Adonai heye ozer li.
Hear, O Lord, and have mercy on me. O Lord, be my help.
Hafachta mispedi lamachol li, pitachta saki v'ta'azreni simcha.
You turned my lament into dancing. You undid my sackcloth and girded me with joy.
Laman yizamercha chavod v'lo yidom, Adonai Elohai la'olam odeka.
That my whole being might sing hymns to you endlessly. O Lord my God, I will praise you forever. Great, thank you, Danny. Okay, a couple of things just to get us started here. And Lex, I'm still seeing Danny. Is that intentional?
What do I need to do something?
No, it's Lex should be.
Oh,
So you can pin a particular page to be visible. The screen share is going, so
I got it.
it
Okay,
should be, yeah.
great. Okay, fine. Just wanted to make sure we're good. Thank you. One of the kind of most fundamental and basic questions about this text is whether it is about illness specifically, or might it be about more generically some kind of misfortune. Many of you will remember that in the last session, we talked about how part of the power of the Psalms is perhaps paradoxically in their ambiguity and elusiveness. The fact that they don't specify circumstances so concretely allows people in different kinds of situations to imagine themselves and find themselves in the text. I think that if you just read this text, certainly without the superscription, without the Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, you would likely come to the conclusion that it is a text about illness and healing. However, and I think this point is really, really critical, the image of illness and healing is not infrequently used metaphorically in the Hebrew Bible, in Tanakh. And I gave you on your source sheet several examples of that. And that's important because it is possible in any text, you have to, like this, you have to question whether illness might be a metaphor for exile. And healing, in contrast, would be a metaphor for the ending of exile. That becomes especially relevant here because of all of the superscriptions in the book of Psalms, none is odder on the face of it than the superscription to this one, right? We begin with Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, a psalm, a song for the dedication of JPS here hedges, the house. Probably you would have normally translated the temple, LeDavid. And then we talked about a couple times already, for David, by David, for the Davidic king and the musical tradition of David, whatever LeDavid might mean. Now, on first reading, one is left to wonder, why is there a psalm that appears to be about a person healing from illness, and the superscription added to it is a song for the dedication of the temple. I mean, it is really very odd. And I'm not sure I can make the oddness go away, but the best explanation I have for it is whoever added the superscription, and superscriptions are thought of by scholars as some of the earliest examples of midrash in the Bible itself. They are interpretive. They are usually not seen as, original to the Psalms. So whoever attached this superscription, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, whoever attached that to this particular psalm, I think clearly took a psalm about illness as metaphorical. In other words, as referring to what it was like for Israel as a whole to operate with no access to a temple, right? And so when you then see, this is just a great example of a midrashic reimagining of what a psalm is doing. A psalm that was ostensibly about an individual being sick is now understood as a psalm about a collective that has been restored to health, that is to its rightful place, that is in a rebuilt Jerusalem. There might be other possibilities that you could offer here for what's going on, but I think that probably makes the most sense. I guess I should add, because this is important for the history of Jewish liturgy, that there is an older view, that this psalm is about the victory of the Maccabees and the rededication of the temple that followed upon their victory. And as early back as Masechet Sofrim, one of the minor tractates of the Talmud, this psalm is associated with Hanukkah. By the way, I think I mentioned this last time, but also keep in mind for the question of what LeDavid means. If LeDavid is taken to mean by David, this is a particularly odd psalm to attribute to David, given that he never lived to see any temple, right? Which is why I think JPS translates house in an attempt with certain traditional scholars to take this psalm to be about the dedication of the royal palace. That seems to me to be very unlikely, but you understand what drives them, I think. Okay, now, so we have here, as we get to the psalm itself, Aromimcha Adonai ki dilitani, which JPS, I extol you for you have lifted me up. I want to actually just probe and maybe read a little more literally so that we get a better view of the imagery that this text is playing with and drawn to. Aromimcha, I will raise you up, right? I will elevate you, God. I will raise you up because ki dilitani, which JPS again renders you lifted me up. But dilitani, some of you who speak modern Hebrew will be familiar with the word dli for bucket. Ki dilitani, you have scooped me out. You drew me out of the water. Death, as we'll see, is imagined as a deep pit. Many times in Tanakh, death is a bore. It is a deep pit. So when God saves the speaker, God, as it were, reaches into the pit of death, pulls him up, draws him out, and the psalmist in response essentially says, you lifted me out, so I will lift you up. That's the kind of physical visualization of what's going on here. You lifted me up, therefore I will raise you. And then the reason is, and in addition, velo simachta oivaili, you have not let my enemies rejoice over me. The NIV translation, I think, actually is more astute here, right? You did not allow my enemies to gloat over me, which I think captures what simachta here means much better, because the rejoice would be in his downfall and suffering. And please recall what we've talked about in the earlier sessions about enemies are one of the great mysteries of Sefer Tehillim, of the book of Psalms. Who exactly is being referred to is somewhat opaque. Now, verse 4, Adonai he'elita min Sheol nafshi, you brought me up from Sheol, chiyitani mi yordi vor, you protected me, you kept me alive from going down into the pit. Some of the ancient manuscripts of this text appear to take the second line to be chiyitani mi yordei vor, right? You save me from among those who have gone down. Not you saved me from going down, but you saved me from among those who went down, which would be consistent with what we just saw about being pulled out of the pit of death. Okay? In other words, the psalmist was almost dead, and God saved him. And here, Bor and Sheol are synonyms. They are the place where the dead in the biblical imagination live some kind of attenuated, faded, shadowy kind of existence. Okay, so the kind of effusion of praise here is, I was almost dead, you lifted me up, you saved me from being gloated over by my enemies, and I really was as good as dead, and you picked me up, okay? And then he turns and says, he invites the people to a ritual of thanksgiving in the temple, where his family or friends or whatever it might be are going to celebrate his return from illness and isolation back into the community. And what he says here is interesting. Zamru l'Adonai chasidav, sing to God, you who are faithful to him, v'hodu lezecher kodsho, and praise God's holy name. The primary meaning of hodu, this is, I forgive me if I've talked about this, but this is one of my favorite examples for explaining to people who speak modern Hebrew why they should not assume that because they speak modern Hebrew, they also speak biblical Hebrew. If I said to you, lehodot in modern Hebrew, you would most likely take lehodot to mean to thank. But lehodot primary meaning in biblical Hebrew is to praise. And biblical Hebrew has no obvious way of saying thank you other than praise you. At the risk of a mild digression, I will just share that I think the reason why the same word in biblical Hebrew means praise and thank is that essentially praise is what happens to thanks when I forget about myself. In other words, thanks is, oh God, you are so kind, you saved my life. Praise is, oh God, you are so kind. It's the moment when I forget about myself. Self-transcendent thanks is praise. The same logic, by the way, applies to yirah. Why is the word yirah taken to mean both fear and awe? Because awe is what happens to fear when I forget about myself. Fear is, oh God, you're so mighty, you could smite me. Awe is, oh God, you're so mighty. When I forget about myself, I progress from thanks to praise and from fear to awe. Okay, now, so Zamru Adonai Chasidav Hodu Lezecher Kodsho. So sing to God, and praise God's name, and then comes this very interesting statement that is a little bit hard to translate. Ki rega be'apo chayim birtzono. JPS renders, for he is angry but a moment, and when he is pleased, or you might want to say, but when he is pleased, there is life. Now, first I want to just mention that the idea of God being angry only for a moment, I gave you some examples of that on your source sheets. That is a very basic idea in biblical theology. One of the reasons why I feel that I can say till no matter how many times people yell at me, that the God of the Hebrew Bible is a God of love rather than anger, is because it seems to me clear from a variety of places in biblical theology that loving is something God is, and angry is something God gets. Anger is not a permanent state of God in the Hebrew Bible. Love is. And in fact, without getting into a whole kind of piece of biblical theology here, anger in the Bible is on some level most often about thwarted, frustrated love. And this notion that God was angry briefly is probably most famously associated with Yeshayahu Nun Daled, Psalm 54, but also, Isaiah 54, and also Psalm 103, which most Christians who are pious know by heart, and most Jews who have never heard of, which is kind of sad. But Psalm 103 is in many ways all about God's love goes on forever, God's anger passes in a moment. But this phrase, Ki rega ba'apo chayim birtzono, could mean what JPS says, for he is angry but a moment, and when he is pleased there is life. But it could also mean God is angry only for a moment, whereas his favor lasts a lifetime. In other words, rather than saying Chaim birtzono, in his when God is pleased, there is life, you take Chaim to be a descriptor of time, that is to mean forever. The NIV and the NRSV, for whatever it's worth, take it the way I'm suggesting. Now, it is worth noting, however, that to the best of my knowledge, the word Chaim alone never means forever anywhere but here. So that's the argument against what I'm proposing and what they're doing. But Kirega Bapo Chaim Birtzono, in the logic of what's being said there, it seems to me to make much more sense to say a moment in God's wrath, a lifetime in God's delight, that kind of thing, as opposed to in God's pleasure there is life. And then actually, I guess I'll mention one other possibility that the Semitic scholar Richard Clifford suggests, that Kirega Be'apo Chaim Birtzono means that the divine anger and the crisis that the psalmist finds himself in is part of a process that leads to life. This moment, it's not a contrast, it's this moment of anger will lead to Chaim Birtzono, or will lead to either a lifetime in God's pleasure or pleasure that is God's pleasure that is life. You can choose among any of those three possibilities, I think. Okay, now, Ba'erev Yalim Bechi V'Laboker Rina, one may lie down, in tears and wake up in joy. Now, the interesting question that is, I think, raised by what we've just read, Kirega Be'apo, for a moment in God's anger, is, what was God angry at? And there really are two very different ways of reading this text, about which I confess I'm not really sure which one I'm in favor of. I'll tell you what my leanings are, but I'm not sure how much weight anybody ought to give that. Is it the issue that in this psalm, God's anger is mysterious? The psalmist doesn't know why God is angry? Or is it perhaps that verse 7 is a clue that will explain why God was angry with the psalmist? So let's read that verse for a minute again. V'ani amarti v'shalvi, when I was untroubled, I said, Bal emot le'olam, I will never be shaken. Now, it is common among Bible scholars to read that verse as a confession of complacency and overconfidence. Ve'ani amarti b'shalvi, when I was all self-satisfied, modern Hebrew, you might say, iti sha'anan, I was just kind of like full of a sense of my own greatness and unshakability. And I said, Bal emot le'olam. I ended up with a false sense of security. And therefore, what's being described here is on some level a psalmist who is being punished or was being punished. I will say that other Bible scholars, I think they're a minority, basically say nothing here betrays any sense that he's done anything wrong. Rather, his point is that God's anger, even if it's inexplicable, is short-lived, and therefore he was able to tolerate it. And the argument that those scholars make is that reading Ani Amarti B'Shalvi Bal Emot Le'olam as a confession of complacency, they argue, is essentially motivated only by the scholar's discomfort with the psalm being about a God whose anger is inexplicable. I'm not sure. I have to say, I'm inclined to agree with the majority here that Vani Amarti B'Shalvi Bal Emot Le'olam, I think there is something in biblical theology, and this is really, as we would say, inyana diyoma. This is really in some very deep way about the moment that we find ourselves in. Biblical theology, and forgive me because I've been teaching online so much that I can't remember where I've said what. So please forgive me if I'm in the mode of repeating myself here. But Biblical theology is really obsessed with the idea, I think, that it is nothing but a grievous temptation to imagine that I am autonomous and independent and okay on my own. Self-sufficiency is always an illusion. I depend on other people and especially on God. And as I think I have talked about in this session, in this group, that's especially a preoccupation of the book of Deuteronomy, where the land is promised to the people, and God's great fear is that they will convince themselves that every blessing they have, they earned themselves, and therefore it is permanent. And God wants them to constantly be kind of aware of their own vulnerability and indebtedness. Just to be clear what I meant by saying this is inyana dioma, I'm not in any way, God forbid, here suggesting that what we're all living through is a punishment for anything. I'm just suggesting actually that it is not a bad moment to remember how unautonomous, vulnerable, and needy and in need of others we really are. I do kind of, I think what I'm saying is that the notion of Baal Emot Le'olam does strike me as, from a biblical perspective, a troubling thing for the psalmist to have said, and may in fact therefore make sense to hear as an admission of failure. Now, if you look at verse 8 for a minute, Adonai b'irtzoncha ha'emadeta laharari oz. I'll work on that phrase in a minute, but let's just use JPS for now. For you, O Lord, when you were pleased, made me firm as a mighty mountain. That makes it sound like back when he was in an impregnable fortress, he knew it was a function of God. But my question is whether verse 8 speaks from his present understanding, whereas verse 7 spoke from what he used to think then. Or if I wanted to be a little bit inflammatory, I might say, even if he knew God was behind his blessings, unfortunately, in human psychology, there is not necessarily, it is not necessarily impossible for people to know on some level that they didn't do it all themselves, and yet to be incredibly complacent and self-satisfied anyway. But my gut, and again, I'm saying this somewhat tenuously, but my gut for how to understand what he said here is, verse 7 is how he did think, and now verse 8 is him speaking in the present tense of what he now understands. Adonai b'irtzoncha, when you were pleased, right? Then I was strong like a mountain. But now, but then when you hid your face, I was terrified. Sorry, I've lost my place in my notes here for a second. Bear with me for 1 second. Okay, sorry, I apologize. Now, Hebrew-wise, "He'emadeta leharari oz" is a very odd phrase. You made stand my mountain, something like that. Alter tries, you made me stand mountain strong, possible. You made me as strong as a mountain, whatever, something like that. So in other words, I was an impregnable fortress. And then again, he started fanecha, you hid your face, or when you hid your face, I was utterly terrified. Now, the next verse is a good example of one of the central problems in Sefer Tehillim, which is tenses. It is very easy in biblical Hebrew to sometimes take phrases that are in the future and hear them in the past and vice versa. The question is here in verse 9, what is being said? It appears that he is now praying to be saved. Eilecha Adonai ekra vel Adonai et chanan. I call to you, O God, and I plead with you. Except look at how JPS renders it, which is the standard way of understanding it here. I called, past tense, to you, O Lord. To you I made my appeal. Now, even many scholars who hear this in the present tense see this as the psalmist quoting what he said back then. But it's possible, I suppose, to read this psalm as less resolved than one might otherwise think. But again, I think more likely it's a reference to what he said back then. And then he says, and this is another great Hebrew pun, Mabetza bidami birdeti al shachat. What is it that is to be gained? Mabetza bidami, from my blood. However, bidami could also be vocalized to yield mabetza bidomi. What benefit is there to you if I go silent? And of course, if you let me die, then I will go silent. Dami and domi there work beautifully together. This is not in a way dissimilar from what I talked about a couple of sessions ago in Psalm 19 about Avdechani's harbahem. Your servant is careful about them, and also your servant is lit up about them, lit up by them, illumined by them. Maybe I'll just mention here that these letters are incredibly open to being played with. In the Song of the Sea, we have Bigdol Zroacha Yidmu Ka'aven, with the might of your hand, the dwellers of Canaan, Yidmu Ka'aven, they became like, from the word domeh, a stone, but Yidmu could also be from Dalid Mem Mem, they became silent like a stone. To become like a stone is to become silent like a stone. Those are puns that work together beautifully, as this one does. So mabetza bidami, birditi el shachat. That is, if I go down to the pit, hayodcha afar, does dust praise you? Hayaged amitecha, does it preach your faithfulness? I guess it's worth hearing here what is going on here. I think one of the assumptions that many psalms make is that the primary human vocation in life is to sing God's praises. That's a hard idea to wrap our neshama around in the secularized world that we live in. But in other words, if my vocation is to sing God's praise, if you kill me, the very thing I was created for will no longer happen. And we have that in various places, including in Psalm 6, which is part of Tachanun. The interesting question is, I think I may have given you some more examples in the source packet as well. In Psalms like this, and this relates to something we talked about in the last session, it's possible to read the psalmist as appealing to God's self-interest. God, if you kill me, who's going to praise you? That would be unfortunate for you. And giving voice to his own desire to live despite his sufferings. Look, I live to praise you. Don't make me go quiet. I think you can read the psalm either way. You might even decide that they're not mutually exclusive. And I want to make maybe two other observations, one which I find not so convincing, and one which I think is just worth noting in terms of the Hebrew. Another possibility that is admittedly somewhat far out for mabetza bidami is that there is another meaning of the root dalid mem mem besides being silent. Dalid mem mem being silent is, like kol demama daka, silence. But dalid mem mem, according to Semitic philologists, also can mean to moan or cry. In the Heart of Torah, I played around with the idea, borrowing from the Bible scholar Baruch Levine, that when Moshe tells Aaron, when Aaron's sons die, and it says Vayidom Aharon, which, countless divrei Torah have been launched around the idea of Aaron being silent, which probably is the pshat, but it also gives you a really different verse if Moshe tries to silence Aaron, and then the Torah says Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron went right on moaning, forgive me. Mabetza bidomi, if that meaning of damam, what scholars call damam too, is here, would be what benefit is there in my going on crying all my way down to the pit. I don't know. It's not crazy. Seems a little far-fetched, but worth thinking about. For those of you who have never studied with me before, welcome to my rather bizarre inner dialogue here. I'll give you an explanation and then tell you why I don't buy it, but that's the best I can do right now. The other thing I wanted to mention that I do think really matters a great deal is when we have here in verse, oh, you know what? I'm sorry. It's actually, let me read 11 first and then say it. Shema Adonai v'choneni, hear me, God, and JPS renders, have mercy on me. Adonai ozerli, oh Lord, be my help. In verses 9 and 11, we have the root chet nun nun, chanan, right? Elecha Adonai ekrav Adonai et chanan, and then Shema Adonai v'choneni. The root chanan actually means, at least most of the time, show me grace. That is, give me what I do not have a right to demand from you. And that, which is why I would be inclined to translate, even though the JPS translation of verse 11 is not wrong, hear, O Lord, and have mercy on me, I would actually be inclined to translate this as, hear me, Lord, and show me grace. Now, this is one of the interesting contrasts between Judaism and Christianity. For Christians, the word grace is so fundamental that, if you ask someone what does grace mean, they look at you like you were off the wall. But most Jews associate that word so clearly with Christianity that I've done this countless times. I say to a room full of very educated Jews, tell me what the word grace means in English. And it's very hard for people. So let me just actually make sure that it's totally clear. Richard, this is an anthropological experiment for you to witness. Grace means essentially, right? That which I am not owed, but am given anyway. That's what salvation by grace, as opposed to salvation by works, means to Christians. But the interesting question here is the psalmist actually saying something quite interesting and emotionally and spiritually powerful here, which is, oh God, I know I can't demand this of you, but I am asking you, right? I'm asking you to give me something that you don't owe me. That I think is actually really quite interesting. Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about in one of his drashot how significant spiritually it is, or ought to be, for Jews that another word for bakasha, for asking God for things, is techina, which means requests for grace, not demands. The reason I have mixed feelings about that is that there are quite a few psalms in which it's clear that the psalmist believes the psalmist is fully within his rights to make demands upon God and doesn't think it's all grace. He thinks God, by entering into a relationship with him, has obligations. But in any case, here, there is this moment that I think is quite moving about, oh God, please show me grace. I can't demand this. I can only ask for it. Now, to return to something that we already talked about the last time as well, Shema Adonai v'choneni, hear, O God, or listen, God, and show me grace. Adonai heye ozerli, O God, help me. This goes back to that idea that we talked about, that for these texts, God's presence or solidarity is insufficient. What they want is to be saved, to be rescued, to be healed. And that, again, might return us to the question I asked at the beginning about, how does one navigate or negotiate, to the extent that you find these texts to be liturgical in your life in some way, a place where the psalmist might have a theology that you don't fully find yourself standing inside of. But I think there's, you could even argue, to be anachronistic, that from the perspective of these psalms, a lot of more what I will call liberal versions of traditional theism. That is, the idea that there really is a transcendent God who has a will and some kind of personality, and yet doesn't actively intervene to save people, but is more about presence, that this psalm, as it were, critiques that kind of theology and says, that's not good enough, right? I want salvation, not just solidarity. I want to be rescued, not just to have you knowing that you're here with me. Knowing that you're here with me and $1.50 will not get me on the subway. I'm saying that to be offensively for a reason. I'm just trying to kind of provoke what might be at stake in this conversation. I fully expected there would be people who would say, what are you talking about? It gets me everything I would ever want. Okay, so I'm just trying to understand what might be at stake in the theological and the emotional dimensions of the theology here. Then I'm just gonna finish up the psalm and then go through the questions, which I have not been looking at in order to, unlike last time, not lose my train here. Hafachta mispedi lemacholi. This is a flip of Lamentations chapter 5. Ne'apach le'evel mecholenu. Misped is lament. Machol is dance. So you took my lament and you turned it into dance. Pitachta saki, the image is that you took off my sackcloth. Vate'azreni simcha, and you clothed me, girded me with joy, which might refer to some kind of festive attire, or might be more purely metaphorical. You know, my clothing is joy. I was clothed, meaning like surrounded by, enveloped in joy. Lima'an, which is a hard word here. So that is salvation, so that God's praises can be said. Leman yizamercha chavod velo yidom, that my whole being might sing to you and not be silent. There is my bolstering of why I think the mabetza bidami might be an intentional pun, because here you have yidom, which clearly means to go silent. So I suspect that that's a a conscious play. So that my being can praise you, can sing praises to you and praise you without cease. I have to confess that this is one of the cases where I don't know why Robert Alter chooses to render this verse, "Oh, let my," in other words, as a plea. I'm not sure why he takes lema'an to mean that here, to be honest. I'll just say one other thing, that the word kavod, JPS renders my whole being. Some of the ancient Greek translations here have kaved, my liver, which in the metaphor of body parts in the ancient Near East would be sort of like heart, the place where I feel and have conscience. JPS rather, NRSV rather colloquially translates my soul, which is problematic for multiple reasons. Now, one thing about structure here is that it began, I want you to see the literary envelope. If you look at verse 2, Aromimcha kidilitani, I will praise you, and there is the reason for my praise. In verses 12 and 13, Hafachta misbedila macholi lema'an yizamercha chavod. There is the reason followed by the praise. Right? That's the envelope. Was that clear what I meant by that? ABBA. In the beginning, praise, explanation, and at the end, explanation, praise. And I think it's worth noting, this maybe really will be my last observation here, le'olam odeka is a tremendous reversal of balemot le'olam. If balemot le'olam really meant, I will never be shaken, here, le'olam now becomes a statement of gratitude and indebtedness. Le'olam what? Not balemot, but rather odeka. I will praise you. I will realize that self-sufficiency was an illusion. I am always dependent upon you. I think that's actually kind of a magnificent literary play that goes on here. Now, let me begin to look at some of these questions. And if we have time, that's one other thing maybe we'll get to, but okay.
The first ones are a little ways up, so I'll help just find where the questions began. The first question, well, there's one sort of very quick question about why two reishes in Harari.
That's just a literary ancient Hebrew thing. That's not all that particular meaning there. By the way, Lex, I'm a little disturbed that you didn't quote for everyone to see Sarah Brooks's beautiful observation about my beard, which I thank her for.
Oh gosh.
And actually, I do want to actually say something about Sarah's comment earlier, if I could. Seems this is more about depression rather than a physical illness. Yeah, well, so I guess it's a really interesting observation. I think that it is possible to read that. But again, to go back to what I've been talking about, because the situation is intentionally vague, it's very hard to know what is about depression and what is about the emotional consequences of severe physical illness. I'm not sure you can tease that apart in a text like this. I think they're both plausible readings. So I appreciate your mentioning that. I'm not sure that that's a resolvable question. You may actually just, I would say from a religious perspective, rather than a kind of historical critical perspective, you should hear in this whatever resonates. From a historical critical perspective, I'm not sure that's a really that difference can be really, at the end of the day, discerned in these texts. Sorry, Lex, did you have questions you wanted to highlight?
No, I was just helping because I figured you might have to scroll a little bit to find them. But the
so
next
I'm okay, I think, here.
Great.
The old JPS, Richard points out, renders in verse 11, be gracious to me. Great, I'm happy to hear that. Emily Mfish asks, do you think verse 4 is supposed to make us think of the Joseph story, or is that just my brain on a hamster wheel? On its hamster wheel, no less. Interesting. Is there a middle ground I can choose between those two options? Which is that canonically speaking, it makes sense that a Jew hears a reference to Joseph being drawn out of the pit, but I'm not sure I see any reason to assume that every image of being drawn out of the pit in a psalm is somehow an allusion to Joseph. So I would want to split the difference with you there. A canonical reading, in other words, just in case that term is not clear to people, is, given that the canon has certain texts, when you read the canon as a whole, there are certain connections you can make that may not have been intended by either of the original texts, but that may not matter. Much of Talmudic discourse does precisely that. Talmudic discourse about Tanakh. Reba says, what right does a psalmist have to make that demand in verse 11? Well, if you meant what I think you meant, that's why he's asking for grace. But again, many psalms of lament do seem to believe that they do have a right to make such demands of God. There is a kind of bilateral relationship. You don't have, this posture always, or even most of the time, of, oh God, I'm sorry, I don't mean to ask you anything. Please forgive me for disturbing your holiness. It's not like that. Again, as I talked about, I think, once or twice before, that's what makes the Psalms of Lament so audacious and so shocking to a lot of people. What is the significance, Richard asks, of the fact that the language of Psalm 38 about God hiding God's face and the psalmist's fear is used in Psalm 104:29 to refer to animals? Richard, you and your intertextuality, I can't do all this at once. Hold on. Let me just go back and take a look again. That's a text that I hope to do in this series. If you would like to unmute yourself, you should feel free to tell me what you think is going on there. I mean, I guess I would just say that I think Psalm 104, which is, by the way, for Jews who are kind of really actively inside of liturgy, is the Psalm for Rosh Chodesh, what we call colloquially Barchi Nafshi. In that text is in part about the radical dependence from moment to moment of all creation on God. And actually that God, lets all creation eat out of God's hand. And so I suspect that here and there, what you both have is the sheer terror of realizing, oh my God, I'm really dependent on God and I don't know where God is. So he here is part of, this larger experience that creation as a whole is invited to be reminded of. Richard, if you want to unmute and add to that, or take issue, feel free. In the meantime, Joe says, thinking about this and its place liturgically, the last verse leads us very nicely into Pesukei Zimra. Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly. I don't know. That's my colleague Ellie Confer question about if that's how it ended up there, but it is really striking. in other words, just to flesh that out, if it wasn't obvious, is that you have, so that my very being will never stop praising you, and then I immediately move into, a very large collection of prayers of praise. Sarah's comment, it wasn't a question. Well, I chose to make it one. Are there sources exploring the psychological attachment aspects of terror when the psalmist experiences that God's face is hidden? Interesting question. I would say this, and I don't know if this is what you mean. So, Julie, if I'm totally misunderstanding your question, feel free to tell me that. I think that there is a growing body of literature that tries to take things like attachment theory, object relations, and then especially trauma theory, and use them as a lens through which to interpret certain texts. There is a tremendous amount. I shouldn't say a tremendous amount. There is a growing body of literature, in particular, about Jeremiah and trauma studies, and the ways that Jeremiah interweaves devastation and hope in ways that can be quite dizzying for the reader. This is not literature that I'm particularly on top of at this point, but it is there. And there is literature on the psychological experience of God's absence as well. Richard, you write the words are identical. I assume you're referring to Psalm 104, but tell me if not. I'm still stuck in the superscription, Joe says. How many Psalms could the superscription could have been applied to and still made sense, and why this one? So that's, Joe, that's actually what I meant when I said I can do my best, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be a little troubling to me. Yeah. Shoshana says, the liturgical history theory is that Chanukah Habayit connects to the sacrificial readings before it. Yes, okay, but and that is meant to be separate from Psukei de Zimra, or that's what links the sacrifices to Psukei de Zimra, which would be my question. Okay, more Psukei de Zimra from Betsy. Also, that whatever last night was about, there can be Baboker Rina. Very, very interesting. We invite ourselves into that. Yeah, I mean, you have a bunch of places where the morning is envisioned, understandably, psychologically, as a time of possibility, whereas the evening is a time of great fear and anxiety. That's why, for example, Lahagid Baboker Chasdecha in Psalm 92, I believe it is, the Psalm for Shabbat, Lahagid Baboker Chasdecha, to talk about your love in the morning, ve'emunatcha, and your faithfulness balelot. So that would be my I think that may be going on there. I'll also just mention here at a very far removed from the Psalms that there is an extraordinary drasha of Rab Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, one of the great Hasidic masters of the 19th century, who talks about how the reason we talk about God's Ahava Rabbah in the morning and Ahavat Olam, God's enduring love, in the evening, is because the morning is a time of vastness and effusiveness. The light is everywhere. There's new possibility. But in the evening, there is Ahavat Olam. There is enduring love, because that's not a time for great passion. That's a time for commitment. Very, very beautiful. Actually, in the chapter of the book I'm writing about marriage, I actually use that as a way of thinking about how marriage works. Young people expect Ahava Rabbah at all moments, and then realize that an awful lot is about Ahavat Olam. Rachel says, can you say something about Heschel's dichotomy between transcendent and the immanent? Rachel, can you say something about what you mean by that here? How are you getting that here? Or what's the angle that draws you to that here? Because I'm not totally sure I see it yet. Okay. I think that Oh, wait, sorry. I was referring to your early comment about solidarity versus redemption. Aha. Yes. I think that is the, yeah, well, okay, let me say this. Was it Richard Nixon who used to say, let me say this about that? Um, um, I think that for the Bible, as for Chazal, as for the rabbinic sages, the notion that a transcendent God who was not immanent, or an immanent God who was not also transcendent would be enough, would be risible to them, would just be not, I mean, I know that word is a little inflammatory, but I think they would basically say that's not serious theology. A God who's merely transcendent is a God who doesn't care about the world. A God who's merely immanent is a God who is essentially powerless, feckless, not able to overthrow the forces of evil, etc. And the dialectic of immanence and transcendence is everything to the Bible. Now, Heschel, as you know, in a couple of places says things that I kind of wonder if he really means. God is ultimately transcendent. That he says at one point, only accidentally immanent. That use of the word accident there, I'm not sure whether he means that in some medieval way of saying it, because I don't think he really means that. But the idea is that God, by God's nature, is separate from the world, but God is committed to being radically immanent. But again, I think a radically immanent God, or sorry, let me say it differently, an exclusively immanent God, from the perspective of the biblical writers, is a God who's not relevant, a God who's otios, if you will, like doesn't really matter, because he can't do, and I use here he here advisedly, he can't do what he has promised. I still find personally that, any Jewish theology that essentially ends up picking immanence or transcendence ends up losing the heart of what goes on in Jewish theology. You could say that the great example of transcendence without immanence in the Middle Ages is the Rambam, right? And great example of immanence without transcendence is large swaths of neo-Kabbalistic writing, where I'm not sure that they maintain quite enough of the dialectical back and forth. So, as always, let me conclude by saying I'm happy and grateful to hear people's thoughts. I apologize in advance for not always responding. Between living with illness and all of that, it's hard for me to keep up with responding to email, but I read them, appreciate them, learn from them. If you really need a response and haven't gotten one, please feel free to forward them. You're not bothering me. I'm always happy to get them. And I mean, a lot of you wrote after last session. I really, really appreciated it. Thank you. On Thursday, we're going to look at a psalm that I think is not so well known among Jews. We're going to do Psalm 39. And then next week, in advance of Pesach, we're going to do Psalm 42, 43, which I want to say I'm doing 42 and 43 because, as I understand it, Psalm 42, 43 is a psalm about really wanting to make aliyah to the temple for one of the regalim and being alone and not able to do that. I have to write something about that psalm in the next few days as well. But we're going to do that as the last psalm we do together before Pesach. Thank you all so much for studying with me again today, and I hope to see you Thursday. And in the meantime, really, really sending prayers as always for your safety and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks again to Shai Held. As a reminder, I think folks know this, but this is meeting every Monday and Thursday to explore a new psalm. It's been a fantastic journey so far. This is our third meeting. There are YouTube videos of the past two if you want to go back and catch up if you missed the first couple meetings on Psalm 22 and 19. Is that right? That's the first two Psalms that we
22 and 19 and 22, right? Yes.
Yeah. And so we're excited to keep these going every Monday and Thursday. For those who are curious to learn more about other Jewish Live programs that are available, just head to jewishlive.org and we'll be populating more and more with all of our new programs that are launching. There's already a number of weekly recurring shows that are out there, and we're rolling out new ones just almost every day, it seems like at this point. And keep tabs on the Facebook group as well. That's Jewish Live, all one word. for the Facebook group.
Excuse me.
So thank you all for coming, and we're going to go off the live stream, and we'll see you next time.